well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you. Sorry, we're a little late. We had a technical difficulty here, which always seems to happen. So this is Jenny Woods with the Local Government Commission and the supervisor up here in the Sacramento region. And today we're going to have a webinar on getting your projects funded and writing grant proposals, which we heard from many of you that this was a topic of interest, and so we wanted to work it into our training before the end of the year. And so today, as our speaker, we have Paul Zykofsky, and he's an associate director at the Local Government Commission and has been with LGC for 20 years. He just celebrated his 20th anniversary. So over those 20 years, he's written a lot of proposals. So he has a lot of good information to share with us. So I am just going to turn it over to him to get started.
Okay, great. So how many folks do we have on the line?
We probably have 20.
20, okay. Hope everybody can hear okay. And again, this is going to be sort of an overview on basically grant writing, fundraising, proposal writing. You could spend a whole day. Probably there's courses that go for weeks, but we know we can't cover all of that. We wanted to just give you some key insights into what you want to do if you're going to look for funding for a project. Say you're working for a nonprofit or you're working for a local government and you need to find funding to implement something or to develop a plan or anything like that. That's when proposal writing comes in handy. So this remote's not working now. Okay, you want to just advance? Oh, good. Okay. So we'll talk briefly about just finding funding and grant opportunities. We'll talk about both from the foundation side as well as from government grants that are available. We'll talk about applying for grants and some of the things to watch out for there. We just recently prepared a presentation on that topic for local governments around the state related to active transportation, so I'm going to use that presentation. And then we'll end up talking briefly about just managing your grant. Once you've got it, what do you want to make sure you do well so you don't jeopardize future funding opportunities? Now it worked. What are some sources of funding for nonprofit organizations? Well, private foundations are often the ones that people look to. There are different types of private foundations. The most common really are independent, what are called independent private foundations, where there's no one person or benefactor, say, Rockefeller Foundation. Rockefeller doesn't still, run the foundation, but it's basically made an independent foundation with a board and staff and so on. There are also family foundations that are funded by families, where the family still is involved in the governance of that foundation. And I'm trying to think, there's one that we work with, a very small one, called the Osprey Foundation, for example, where the family is on the board. They're sort of directing the operation of the foundation. Then there's also, it's not working. Corporate foundations. Some of you may have heard that Walmart, for example, has a foundation, right? Oh, there we go. Okay, good. We don't want Kay's screensaver coming up, or I guess it's the LGC screensaver. And then finally, there are private operating foundations, and you'll hear about those. Those are sort of interesting. We've had some dealings with some of them over the years. They're set up as foundations, but then they actually often they don't grant, they don't provide funding to outside entities. They run projects themselves. One of the ones that we've worked with over the years is called the Orton Family Foundation, for example, based in Vermont, and they fund issues related to land use and small town development and so on, but they basically run projects. They don't actually give money away. They may sometimes give some grants, but a lot of times they're just out there doing their work. The ones you see on the right here are all, large. Well, Ford Foundation is, basically an international foundation. They do grant making all over the world. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is the largest health philanthropy that's out there, and we've actually worked quite a bit with them over the last 12, 13 years when they started working on health in the built environment, and they were really interested in how changing where people live and communities can help improve health outcomes. Hewlett Foundation is one of the California foundations that also works internationally. They have grants in Latin America, I know, and probably other areas. And we'll actually look at their website in a minute. And California Endowment is, as the name implies, a California foundation, works a lot on health. We've worked with them over the last few years. They have a project that funds 14 areas in cities and counties in California trying to create healthier communities. So on the government side, so that's sort of the foundation side, just very briefly. On the government side, there's different types of grants. There's federal grants, those are the housing and urban development, and that's sort of the example I put up here. You'll often hear them, the initial call will often be called a NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability. And sometimes they're in the register, I forget the name of the register, the public Federal Register. There's notice, they have to put it out there, and the Federal Register, it comes out every day, and there's a notice, and then people, you go to the website, and often they're very complex and very challenging to respond to. And you've got to realize that if it's a federal grant, there's going to be a lot of competition, obviously. All 50 states, are going to be eligible to apply, so there'll be, local governments, organizations all over the country. Most of these federal funds or federal grants go to local governments, but there are quite a few that are also focused on, nonprofits. So if you're a nonprofit organization, you have a good chance there. State types of grants, I put up one that we worked with recently, which is from Caltrans. It's called the Active Transportation Program. This is one that funds local governments that want to, for example, do work on bicycling, improving conditions for bicycling and walking. And it was basically a consolidation of a bunch of other grant programs. They took them all combined safe routes to school and bicycle funding and trails funding into one big pot. And we'll look actually at that. Actually, no, we're going to look at a different Caltrans application in a minute. And then there may be regional grants that are available. In Sacramento area, for example, SACOG, some of you have been working at SACOG know this, they have, there's the Active Transportation Program, but then they also have a community design grant program that they started, I think about 10 years ago, where every couple of years, I don't think they do it annually, but every 2 or 3 years, they put out funds that local governments in the region, the SACOG region, can apply for. The same goes for SCAG, for example, in Southern California. And there are other regional agencies, MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations, councils of government that on occasion will have these grants available. Often they're passing through funding that's either coming from the state or the feds for projects. Local grants are probably less common, though I think they probably do exist out there. I was trying to think of an example of one. More likely what you'll see is requests for proposals from local government, where a local government will have a project and they'll be looking for a consultant team to do the work. And more we're starting to see nonprofits be involved in that. For example, around safe routes to school, when they need basically somebody to manage a safe routes to school program, which involves working in schools and making it easier for kids and kids to get to school. They often will partner with nonprofits. So that may be an opportunity for an example of where a local government put out an RFP that might include or might be targeted to nonprofits, or might be a partnership of nonprofits with maybe a consulting firm, and so on. Can anybody think of any other types of funding opportunities that maybe exist out there? I've talked about sort of foundation and government, but anything else occur to you?
You can type it into the question box.
Yeah, if you're online, just type it in. I've sort of touched on
Crowdfunding.
Yeah, crowdfunding is one that's becoming more and more. I mean, if you look online right now, there's lots of information on crowdfunding. It's a little bit more complex than I originally thought. I think some of the early crowdfunding was very much, people just donate money because they want to see something good happen. Now, there are actually tax rules that IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission has adopted some rules that regulate crowdfunding. So it's gotten much more complicated. One of my colleagues sent me some information a few days ago because basically people are investing. So it's like, okay, how do you manage that? You know, in the old days, we knew how to manage, well, we thought we knew how to manage money invested in the stock market. But now it's sort of a new type of investing. So you're seeing rules around that. Yeah, crowdfunding. Regional foundations. That's right. Regional foundations is a good one to mention. And often community foundations sort of fit into that category. And if you're working at the local level, that's often a really good place to start. Starting with your, regional foundation. For example, in the Bay Area, there's an East Bay Foundation that, as the name implies, works just in the East Bay of the Bay Area. There's also the San Francisco Foundation, which focuses on the peninsula. In the Sacramento, there are a lot of community foundations that you see, and even up in Reading, for example. I remember years ago, I think it was working either with it wasn't called the Reading Community Foundation, but it was a foundation that funded a lot in that region. So that's a great, often a good place to start, especially with local projects, because they're looking at supporting local organizations. Let's see, anybody with nonprofits like LGC? Yeah, that's a good point. We sometimes are pass-throughs for funding. I mean, we don't actually, it's not our money that's being put out there, but it's often we're managing grants for other programs. So some of the climate energy upgrade work sort of involved. I don't know if it was open to nonprofits to apply. Maybe Jenny, Yeah, but there are some projects we work on that are planning projects. We're putting out an RFP, often looking for technical, sort of private sector consultants to apply, but sometimes nonprofits can be part of that too. Organizations can be part of those teams. Okay, so the thing, this is sort of probably one of the most important slides I think up here, which is basically if you're going to, go out and look for funds, before you even get started, it really helps to, do the research, talk to as many people as possible, network, talk to organizations and other nonprofits that do similar type of work. I think in the nonprofit world, I think we're all pretty open about sharing our experiences. I mean, I often get asked the question, well, how do you get funded? Where do you get money? And we're pretty transparent about talking about how we do that. I think it's a fairly collaborative sector. I mean, there may be a little bit of competition sometimes, and you don't want somebody competing for your, the pot of money that you have. But I think for the most part, you can reach out and talk to other nonprofits. Then, the other issue is just research, who funds the types of projects that you're interested in. There's tons of foundations out there, but a lot of them have very narrow focus. So you have to really find the foundations that are interested in the issues that you're looking at. The same goes for government grants, same kind of thing. You've got to, and with government grants, I think it's a little bit simpler because you sort of look in that area that you're trying to get funded. If it's related to to water issues, you would look at Department of Water Resources, or if it's related to the environment, you might look at federal EPA grants. You might also look at state Cal EPA grants and see what's available out there. I think a really good way to try to track down potential funders is to look for similar projects and see how they got funded. And often, I should mention with the first bullet, when you look on a foundation's website, very often they'll list, everything that, I think they're required to list every grant that they've made and the types of projects they've funded. And they sometimes will have even a searchable database that you can go on and look and see, what kinds of things have they put money into, how much. It tells you also the amount that they typically funded, so that's useful to know. If you have a project that you think is going to cost, $100,000, you want to make sure that the the foundation or agency you're applying to makes grants in that ballpark. There's some foundations that do a lot of very small grants, 20,000. Community foundations, for example, typically will do smaller grants. So it's good to have that picture, and often, again, you can see that on websites and on their literature. Question? Yeah. Well, I think, and that's
Can you read the question?
Yeah, the question is, why is it important to develop a track record for yourself, or do funders see your track record? And I guess if you
they can see it.
If you go down, yeah. You know, I think the next bullet really talks about starting with smaller grants to develop a track record. I think, you know, if you're a fledgling nonprofit, if you're just getting started, you know, foundations are, and government agencies are going to be a little bit more hesitant to give you a grant. You have to develop, you know, a track record, show that you have the, and when we get to managing grants, we'll talk a little bit about that, show that you know how to fiscally, you know, manage grants. I've heard of stories in the past where a nonprofit got a grant and they were working on a different project, and they used the money from that grant, which was supposed to be used for something else, for this other project that they had running because they needed the money. Well, that's something that, you know, a foundation or a government that gives you funding is not going to be very happy about. So establishing a track record, I think, is important. You know, I don't know that I do think that foundations also will look to see who you've gotten funding from in the past to see, oh, okay, is this an organization that's well established, that, you know, has gotten other grants from other foundations that we trust and know. I think that helps. I don't think it's essential, but yeah.
So you're referring to more so a track record for the organization that you're writing on behalf of, not so much you as an individual.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. The track record issue. When I say, you know, start with smaller grants to develop a track record, I really meant it regarding to the organization. You know, you're personally not going to be judged. Really, it's the organization it's coming from. And then finally, this issue of just, you know, trying to get to know funders. I mean, I know that. I mean, I probably should have started out with this, but what do you think is the hardest part about writing proposals or fundraising? What would you think, in your own, you know, if you had to approach this, what do you think is sort of the thing that makes you maybe back off a little bit? Let's see if anybody online also wants to.
For money?
Exactly. I mean, I don't know of anybody. I mean, maybe there's some people out there who like to ask for money, but most of us are really leery. You know, we're reluctant to do that. It's like you're saying, gee, you know, give me something you've got, and, you know, I can make good use of it here. So that's the part that, you know, I think is challenging. But I think we have to recognize, again, that the organizations and agencies we're applying for, that's their job too. I've often joked that I think I would hate to work at a foundation because you could never tell who your real friends are, right? Because people are always going to be calling you and wanting to chat with you and be friends with you. And, you know, maybe because they want your money and they want to make sure that you're going to fund them, not that, you know, that they like you or think you're a great guy. So, and I actually was talking to somebody a few weeks ago who used to work at the Ford Foundation, and I asked him about that, and he did say it was a challenge because, you know, people do befriend you, you know, they have ulterior motives. But that shouldn't mean that you should not try to get to know the people that fund projects. I think the most effective organizations often are ones where, you know, the executive director, their leadership, you know, has ongoing relationships with foundations, funders, and they all know it's, you know, it's a professional relationship. They know that this is something you have to do if you're going to run a nonprofit. You have to know people. You have to know what foundations are interested in. Is it something that your organization, you know, can sort of respond to? So, and I'll hit on that issue of networking with funders again, I think, in the next few slides. I guess I've lost my control here.
If I move that.
Oh, if you move that, then it goes away. Okay. So we'll start out first talking just about foundations, and then we'll talk about government grants. So they are two really pretty different animals. With foundations, you know, one of the things, the third bullet there talks about, do they accept unsolicited proposals? there's a lot of foundations out there that actually, well, maybe not a lot, but there are quite a few foundations out there that basically ask organizations to submit. They basically don't accept unsolicited proposals. They ask organizations, and they go out and they say, okay, we want this group of organizations to apply. And it may be for some programs and not others. So they may accept unsolicited proposals for some, but I think more and more foundations are moving away from just being open and saying, well, usually they'll either have a program or project that they're requesting proposals in, or they'll go out and ask organizations to apply. We've had that happen with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grants that we've had in the past, where we were basically a group, in a group of maybe 20 organizations that were asked to submit proposals with no guarantee that you would get funded. They basically at the outset would say, we're going to fund 8 organizations. Send us, here's what we'd like, the work we'd like done. Send us a proposal, and here are the parameters. And then they picked. And one year we made it, and we were in several years. The next round of funding, we were asked again to submit, but we didn't fit, their criteria as well, so we didn't get funded. So it's, that's it's part of the foundation world. But you can learn a lot if you, and on the next slide actually has some resources to look at. And there's tons of information online, as you can imagine. But you want to know, again, what are the programs that foundations are interested in? What kinds of projects do they fund? What amounts, are they in line with what you're looking for? Deadlines, of course, sometimes they won't have a deadline. They'll just, if they do accept unsolicited proposals, they'll just have sort of a rolling thing where every quarter they'll review whatever proposals have come in. They may say that pretty explicitly. Other times they'll have very clear, these are the deadlines by which we need to receive proposals. Really helpful, I think, again, this is part of the networking. Ask to meet with the program officer for the area, if it's a project dealing with climate change, for example. There's a program officer in, close to where you're based that works on that. There's no reason, no reason not to hesitate to ask for a meeting. And if they have a policy about not meeting, which in my experience, most foundations are pretty open about telling you, no, we don't like to meet, or if they are, open, they'll often be willing to set time, and that's something that is helpful. Yeah, the question or the comment now, really more than a question, I think, is that you've had problems getting grants for rural areas. Many foundations only tend to fund in urban locations, and I think that's true. I think it's harder to find, but I mentioned earlier, yeah, I guess I'm trying to think of foundations that might do more in rural areas. I think it's one of those issues that you have to do the research and see if you can find foundations that understand there are issues in rural areas as well. But that's true. I would say that with government grants, at least in California, we are seeing much more of an emphasis on disadvantaged communities. Which often does mean, also applies in many rural areas. So I think for government grants, I think there's more opportunities opening up now for rural communities. And let's click on that link. I wanted to just bring up. Is it going to work when you click on it?
Oh,
you can
cancel.
Oh, did you just? Oh no, you didn't go out. Okay. Okay. So here's an example. You want to give me that? I'm not sure I'm going to see. So here's an example. This is the Hewlett Foundation, which is started by the founders of Hewlett Packard, and there's actually a Packard Foundation and there's a Hewlett Foundation. And this is sort of their homepage, and it tells you, or their programs actually, it's not the homepage. It tells you the kinds of things that they fund. So they focus on reducing poverty in the developing world, curb carbon emissions that lead to climate change, and improve education for students. And then they'll tell you, under education program, these are the kinds of things so they'll be often very clear about what they fund and what they don't fund. So if you have a project that doesn't really fit into these, you probably are not going to get very far with these foundations. I think if you know the staff foundation and have something that's a little bit off what's listed, then you might be able to talk to them and see if there's a way that they see fitting it in. Their environment program, for example, focuses on the Western United States and Canada for wildlife and people, slow global climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a pretty broad one there. I think there's a lot of different projects. So, if you had a project that dealt with, say, active transportation, you might say, well, that might fit, but it probably would be good to see if they've given funding for, say, bicycling and walking projects or not. Energy supply, clean, consumption is efficient, disadvantaged. And then they have some, programs that are that appear to be more international. They also, because they're based in the Bay Area, they fund performing arts programs in the Bay Area. And then they actually also have sort of a capacity. It looks like this is more focused on capacity building. Effective philanthropy group, which makes grants increase and improve information available to donors about nonprofit performance. So it seems like it could be a way to help other foundations see how nonprofits are working, and also strategic philanthropy, which I'm not sure what that is, but you can check on that, click on that and check. And then you can also look at, recent grants, and just go online and see, what kinds of things have they funded. This was $1 million to the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. For assessing socioeconomic impact of access to contraception. So, specific project, that tells you that the length of time, which program is doing it. So this is a global development and population. So it looks like it's focused on the U.S., Affordable Care Act, but there may be some that are international. So, if you go to the grants page, there's that, they have a database. Not all foundations will do that, but you could, search through keywords for topics or issues that you're interested in, and and see what's available. I think it's hard to read this, but pick the years, region, program, and so on. Let's see, Foundation Center maps. Sure. Let's check that one out. Okay, so this is basically they have a search on on the map and see what grants they've given. You can see that they've worked all over the world, and the types of grants that they've. This just gives you sort of the overview, but you can click on recipient. So again, a lot of different grants and pretty big ones. $10 million, for example, for over 11 grants, I guess, not just one. This is an organization that works on sustainable transportation in Mexico. I've actually gone to their conferences over the years. So interesting. I think you get a lot. In a few minutes, you can sort of get a good feel and understanding for what a foundation does and what types of projects they have. I think the biggest challenge is finding, the right foundations for the project or issue that you're working on. So let's go back to I guess I gotta give this back to you, Jenny. You just click on the bottom. Oh no, you gotta move forward. Okay, cool. And then of course, eligibility. Eligibility is probably a bigger deal when we get to government grants. I mean, if you're a nonprofit 501c3, typically that's who foundations fund, so not usually much of an issue. But when you get to government grants, then you'll start. You really need to be careful. Read carefully who can apply, because there's far fewer grants that government makes to nonprofits. Most of the grants that government makes are to other government entities. These are just, this is just off the top of my head, some places I went. We used to, before the web, there was this Chronicle of Philanthropy, which I remember our executive director used to get, and it was basically like a newspaper. It came out either every week or every month. And she would go in and she would cut out, from the newspaper and send out, here's one that looks interesting, follow it up, look it up, and it was like all kinds of things. Often, since it's a national publication, it's mostly, large foundations and federal grants and so on. But I looked online, they're still there, but you have to actually join, I think, so there is a fee to access their stuff. But there's a lot of free available, nonprofit resource centers are great. There's one in Sacramento, one in the Bay Area, and I'm sure they're in other cities, and some of these other websites as well. Okay,
And if I can just
yeah.
emphasize the importance of doing your research for foundation grants
Yeah.
and how he said about networking and getting to know them, it's really critical. And then really reading those details and doing your research and knowing what they fund, because it looks really bad if you go to them and you don't have a strong understanding of who they are.
Yeah, and I would say also that in my experience in 20 years at LGC, I can't recall a single time when we got funding from a foundation that we had not met and gotten to know before. I think establishing relationships is really, really key. You know, I think we, yeah, you know, at least in my experience, it's possible in other project managers here that they may have been able to get funding without, you know, if they had a really clear project that really, you know, that foundation was really interested in. But most of the time, it's, you know, they need to know who you are, because most foundations will get, I don't know how many times the projects they actually fund in that, you know, interest or applications for. So they may get 10, 20, 30, 100 applications for every one that they fund. So in order to sort of separate out the ones that they're interested in, if they know you, obviously if you have a relationship, then that really helps. Yep.
Are there any specific channels that you guys network with funders, like events or?
Yeah. Actually, we put on the national conference, New Partners for Smart Growth, and we take advantage of that opportunity. There's usually a session at the conference on you know, funding, where we have several foundations come and speak about their projects. We also, you know, often will take advantage of funders being at those conferences to try to set up time to have coffee, especially if there's somebody we haven't met before, you know, there's sort of new funders that are coming, you know, we will take advantage as much as we can. We also have a reception at our conference that's sort of we call it the funders reception, that's focused on funders of the conference, but often it includes foundations, government agencies, and so on, and people who are involved with those come. So we sometimes, you know, that's another opportunity to meet people. There is an organization of funders that has occasional events, but I think mostly they're for their own members. It's called the Funders Network for Smart Growth. That was started about 10, 12, 15 years ago. And there's actually a California sort of section of that. And we occasionally they'll reach out to us or to other nonprofits and say, we'd like you to come and talk about the work you're doing, or invite us to one of their meetings. And that's obviously a great opportunity to, you know, to get to know more funders. One thing to be aware of with foundations is, I mean, I used to joke that they tend to be very fickle. You know, they'll be really interested in one issue or one area for a few years, and then they'll just drop it like a hot potato and move on to something else. So it can sometimes be a little frustrating, and I probably shouldn't be saying that, especially if this is being recorded. But, you know, it is true. I mean, foundations, we were involved years ago in forming a group called the California Futures Network, which was, you know, do sort of lobbying and policy development on smart growth in California. And in the first few years, we had great support from several foundations. And then after like 3 or 4 years, they basically just all changed direction, or some of them changed direction. Funding got pulled, the organization collapsed. You know, it went away, it stopped. You know, it went out of existence at that point. And that's why it's so important for nonprofits not to be dependent on, you know, one source of funding or 2 or 3 sources of funding, but really try to diversify as much as possible. Because foundations do a lot of strategic planning. Almost every time I'm talking to somebody at the foundation, they're going through another strategic plan. They joke about it too. I mean, they know that, but you know, every few years they'll change course. They also have a policy often of rotating their program managers, program officers, because they do know that, you know, if a program officer gets too close to a group of organizations, they may, you know, some favoritism starts entering, so they'll start rotating people. So they'll only have a program officer in place for, you know, 4 or 5 years, and then they'll move them on to, you know, they'll move to a different program, or they'll hire new people. And I've seen people sort of go in, you know, foundations do cycle through program officers over the years. So it's something to just be aware of. But having, having either a relationship or having them at least know who you are and know, where you're coming from, what you've done, and your track record, et cetera, is really important, because I think going in cold is really hard, unless it's one of those foundations like Community Foundation that's soliciting, projects in your region, and they're really open to they want to meet new nonprofits. I think those cases might be a little bit different, but the bigger foundations, really important to establish that relationship.
Any other questions about the foundational funding side of things before we move on to government grants? Okay, well, we'll move on, and if you have any other questions, feel free to type them in at any time.
Okay, so with government grants, again, pretty different in that I'm trying to think if there's, anything as an unsolicited grant for government. I can't think of anything. I think most government grants are going to come out where government has funding, and they'll put out basically, a call for proposal. They'll say, we have funds for, X, Y, or Z, and, local governments, or in some cases consultants, and in some cases consultants and nonprofits, or sometimes just nonprofits can apply for them. So it's going to be a whole range of different types of eligible, and that's where the second bullet I want to emphasize: make sure your organization is eligible, because you don't want to spin your wheels working on a proposal and then find out, oops, they don't fund a nonprofit. And nonprofits, you're going to see a lot fewer grants from government that go to nonprofits overall. I mean, they do exist, but they're not. I would say there's far fewer of them than are going to local government. So if you're working in a local government, definitely, it's a place to look. And particularly now, we're seeing with the cap and trade program, for example, the state's getting an infusion of funding. They're putting some of that funding into. There's one program on affordable housing and sustainable communities. There's another program that's targeting. Some of that funding is going into CAL FIRE for some of their grants. So there's a variety, and then there's the active transportation program from Caltrans. So there's a variety of different funding streams in California, which are starting to actually grow, which is really, really good. The most important thing I'd say about government funding is read the RFP really carefully, read it and read it again and reread it, and make sure you really have a good feel for it. One of the mistakes we've made over the years here is we'll read like the summary, like the executive summary of a proposal, and it sounds great. And it gets sent over to somebody, and we start working on the proposal. And then halfway through it, we realize that this grant really has very little to do with the work we do. And I have this, I can talk about this from personal experience. It happened to me several times, where we end up working on a proposal and spending hours on it, and then you realize, this was a project meant for. There was one we did actually. It came out of SACOG. It was a small one, but nevertheless, it was for basically it was for businesses. It was to reach out to businesses in the region around, I think, clean fuels. And somehow it got, somebody in our office thought this would be a good one for us. And halfway through it, I'm looking at it saying, well, we shouldn't be doing this. It had very little to do, if anything, with local government, which is who we work with. So anyway, so that's really, I think, the key is, make sure you read it carefully, understand, and make sure you're eligible. And then we'll get into some of these details of review, and we'll get, when we talk about this ATP application. One thing that we're seeing a lot more with government grants is partnering. That's been sort of a mantra from grants at the federal level, I'd say, especially with nonprofits. They want to see organizations partner. So, for example, we have a grant for where we provide technical assistance under a U.S. EPA program called Building Blocks for Sustainable Development. Well, that project we applied for with a partnership with like 6 other organizations. And we just felt that, if it was just us on our own, we wouldn't have had a shot. But when we teamed up with Project for Public Spaces in New York City, and Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago, and who else do we have on that? Walkable and Movable Communities Institute. We had 5 or 6 organizations that we'd stand a much better chance, and we did. We ended up getting the grant. And of course, we don't get as much work, we didn't get as much funding from it, but at least we're part of this team that's out there working on stuff. So partnering is something to look for. Some of the federal grants I've seen related to sort of sustainable development, I think, often do emphasize that. You know, things like deadlines, page limits, font sizes, all that. You wouldn't believe how, you know, a simple, you know, mistake of, not having the right, going over the page limit could just, especially with the government bureaucrat, but they have their rules. If they get it and you're half a page over or a few lines over, that would disqualify you if they said the page limit was X, or they may not read anything past the 5-page limit. I had a proposal a few months ago where I was working with somebody, the consultant, and he assumed that the proposal was due at the end of the day, 5 p.m., because most proposals deadline is 5 p.m. So you just naturally assume it was 5 p.m. The morning it was due, he realized the deadline was noon, and he didn't make it. He got it in like half an hour too late, disqualified. So all the work that he had done, out the window.
Or one of the recent ones we did, we only put 2 of the staff in a table, and we were supposed to put all of the staff in a certain table.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the reasons they said we didn't get it.
Yeah. You get points off, or you may get points off.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Will they tell you how they graded you in most cases?
Yes,
They get something
afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, most agencies, I think, at least at the state level here, and federal too, I've found, will do a debrief, but they may not tell you they may not give you a lot of information, but it's always helpful. We've been working with these Caltrans Sustainable Community Planning grants for many years, and typically we'll work on 7 or 8 or 9 of them, and typically we'll get 3, 4, 5 funded, and we always will go back with the ones that didn't get funded and say, okay, well, what? And sometimes they'll just say, well, it was a good proposal, we didn't see anything wrong, there was maybe this little thing here, we didn't have enough funding. So, I mean, that's the reality. But sometimes you do get some really good insights, and you can submit it again the next year, which is what we're doing this year. For this Sustainable Community Planning grant, we have several from last year that didn't get funded. We're going to go back, tweak them, see what we can modify, figure out how to make it work. Yeah.
Question.
Most times it may not always be explicitly stated. It depends on the question is, I can't read the left part of it. Is the need for partnership often explicitly stated? I'm trying to think. I don't think it's always. I think sometimes you need to read between the lines, and if it's sometimes they will explicitly state it. I mean, some of the federal grants I've seen from Housing and Urban Development or EPA will state that they're that they are open, or they're open to partnerships. Often because if it's a complex project where they recognize that no one organization will maybe have all the expertise they're asking for, they'll say partnerships of we favor a partnership that may include a university that can do the evaluation and research, and then maybe 2 or 3 nonprofits.
Or sometimes you'll have to include working with a veteran-owned business for state grants, or a woman-owned business, so you have to pay attention to those and look for places where you can.
For state grants, for state grants particularly, there may be requirements. Federal grants will often basically recommend that you work with disabled or veteran or what's called maybe minority or women-owned businesses. May not require it. You can explain if you looked for somebody but didn't find one. Some state ones require it, like the one Jenny and I worked on a few months ago. It was a firm requirement that some percent of the grant had to go for that. And there's another question. Is there a website or other place where a nonprofit can register in order to receive alerts about cap and trade funding opportunity, or an email list? Do you know?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's part of the problem right now with the cap and trade is it's all spread throughout the various agencies, and they're all on different grant deadlines and different cycles and different requirements and eligibility. And so I know LGC has really been trying to focus on having a little bit more coordination around that, so it's a little bit less intensive for local governments and nonprofits to go after that funding, because there's a lot of different pots of funding to keep track of. LGC did create a fact sheet with kind of like links to where you can find all the various fundings, and then you kind of have to keep track and get on the listserv for those various agencies. And I know the Institute for Local Government has also done something similar on their website. So
yeah, I think the main thing is stay tuned as much as possible, be checking back, you know, and if you're on sort of, you know, newsletters that reach local government that address funding, you know, often you'll hear about those. So let's click on that link there. Just, I guess you've got it on the side. Yeah. Escape.
it almost ended the webinar when I did that.
Oh.
So.
So there's the other one. So this is another example. This is government grant. So this is actually one that just came out on Monday. It's for Strategic Partnership and Sustainable Communities grants from Caltrans. And as you can see, the deadline is October 30th. They're planning grants. You can't build anything with them. These are the ones that LGC has, since their inception back in 1999, we have partnered with local jurisdictions to get these grants. And one of the nice things about these is that they actually, we'll go down to this one page that shows the, okay, here we go. So they got this nice summary chart in here. These are the guidelines where for the sustainable communities, and actually for both of these programs, they have strategic partnerships. They tell you the fund source, federal highway, federal transit, state highway, the types of things they fund, and there's more detail elsewhere in the RFP. And the nice thing about these, as I mentioned, is that they actually do allow nonprofits like LGC to be listed as a sub-applicant. So if you look here, it says, you know, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations. We're not eligible to apply as a primary applicant. We have to partner with a metropolitan planning organization, transit agency, city, county, tribe, etc. But what we've actually done with these grants is we've actually helped. We partner with local jurisdictions, help write the proposals, and then the grants, when they're funded, if they're funded, we actually are built in to do some of the work on the grant. So that's been really a nice model for us. I wish all states proposed RFPs were this simple. These are actually quite simple. It's a short application, maybe 5 pages, 6 pages. They do require a lot of community engagement in the planning process, which we often manage for the project, and so on. So, and it gives you, trying to see what else, if you go through this again, it's one of those things where you really want to read through the whole thing and make sure you're clear on it. These are the goals of the planning. So you want to always be clear on, what kinds of things are they looking for? Because if you've got a project that doesn't fit into one of those, it's not going to really get very far. So here are the state transportation planning goals. You want to make sure that in your proposal you're addressing those. They also list federal transportation planning goals. They used to actually require in the application that you check off which of these you were meeting, or actually they require that you write something. Now they just ask you to check off a box. Yes, we meet this, 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 and this. I think they realized everybody's just writing the same thing over and over. This gives you a little bit more of the background, addresses environmental justice, disadvantaged communities, etc. They give you more background information, and then they've got that overall chart. Let's see, general information. It'll tell you accounting requirements, what they expect. And again, this is going to a local government. Usually they have all, everything that's needed. How to account for some of the budget issues that you're going to have to address. Travel expenses, are they reimbursable? Sometimes there'll be grants that don't reimburse for travel. And then they'll tell you these are ineligible. So you've got to be really, read those really carefully. What's not eligible? And it's weird because they list land use plans or studies. And yet we've done projects with these grants that are land use plans and studies. So it's a little bit, or the other one they put on here was, economic development plans or studies are listed here. But we've done projects that include economic analysis. So in our case, I mean, we know these really well, so sometimes we've been able to go back to Caltrans and just have the way you phrase it. You probably wouldn't want to call it an economic development study, but you might want to say that, as part of the project to improve this, this downtown or this street, you're going to look at, what business, have somebody who can analyze what the business opportunities or what new businesses are needed, what the market demand for certain things is, and they might fund that. See if there's anything else. So I think, again, who may apply, they repeat it, a lot of stuff gets repeated in these. Some of these can be very repetitive. For the active transportation program, there's 3 different documents and very repetitive, but again, it's good to go through them. Local matches, something important with government grants. Often there will be a requirement that the local jurisdiction put up, put some money into the game, whether it's 10%, 20%. With these grants, they actually allow staff time to count as part of the local match. So that makes it easier for local government to say, oh yeah, we can do that, we'll put staff time. Anyway, so let's move on to the last, or the next section. With all the cap and trade money flooding into California now, where's the best way to monitor where grants will become available in the future? I think that, as far as I know, Larry, the main things are there are grants coming out from several different state agencies. So I think the key thing is to be monitoring, those state agency websites.
And we can send the infographic that has the link to all those sites. Okay. But yes, monitoring those.
Yeah, I would suggest monitoring those. We know there's Strategic Growth Council, there's Housing, there's CAL FIRE, there's a number of different agencies involved. So this is actually a presentation we did a few months ago. We were hired by Caltrans, along with the 3 other organizations you see at the bottom, to develop some workshops that we could present to local jurisdictions, particularly disadvantaged and small jurisdictions, to help them apply for these active transportation program grants. So it was an all-day workshop. This was one of the modules we did towards the end of the day. We want to make sure people stayed till the end of the day. So we told them, if you stay till the end of the day, we'll give you the top 10 tips for successful applications. So, and most of this actually was developed by one of our colleagues who works for Rails to Trails Conservancy. So, and some of these, again, are going to be very specific to active transportation program, but I think they're really good tips generally. One is obviously choose projects that fit the program goals, right? By the way, we'll give you all this PowerPoint, so don't feel you have to copy this down. We should probably mention that at the beginning. But you need to, again, see what are the program goals, like we just saw in that previous Caltrans request for proposals, and see, does your project, meet those, and then, make sure that as you develop a project that you're doing that. So in this case, there's those 5 bullets that are listed there, and those are the program goals for the active transportation program. And you may not have to, one of those your project may be a little bit weaker on than others, but at least if you got something you can say about your project and how it addresses those 5 bullets on the right, I think that's really key. One thing we heard that Caltrans actually was encouraging local jurisdictions to do, and that with this program, was to combine infrastructure and non-infrastructure. So they wanted to see proposals that actually, built something, but also then had a program where, it encouraged people to walk and bike more, or to, or to start a walking school bus for a school or something like that. And actually, a lot of cities didn't do that, and yet they were giving more points when they did. So that's sort of another part fitting the program goals. Having a multidisciplinary team, that's, I think, really key. With more and more projects are saying, or requests for proposals are saying, we really want you to not operate in silos. In this case, again, they were looking at teams that could, too many in the past, a lot of these active transportation proposals were coming from engineering, departments or public works departments, which were very narrowly focused on. We want to build 1,000 feet of linear feet of sidewalk or something like that, and really not looking at, public health issues, bringing in, where is it, what is this connecting, how is this going to help the economy of this community, how is it going to help the health of the community. So they're really looking at, they're trying to, get locals to again, break out of the silos and work in a multidisciplinary way, which I think is similar to what we talked about on the foundation side in terms of the desire for partnering. This was, I think, one that some of the folks that put this presentation together reviewed a bunch of proposals, and they, I think, and we've just gone through a similar process with the second cycle of grants, and it is pretty shocking how many times you go through the proposal and you see that people really didn't read through all the instructions, or didn't read them carefully and didn't follow them. In the case of active transportation, there were 3 sets of documents that people really needed to review carefully. Learn from the winners, and this goes back to with foundations, looking at similar proposals and projects they've gotten. Now with foundations, I'm not sure you'll find the actual proposal on their website. You'll find the projects they funded. The nice thing with these state grants is they'll actually have the winning, the high scoring applications are actually available. You can look at them and see what did they put in there, how do they present their project, and learn from basically from their success. In this case, the Cycle 1 projects were posted on the California Transportation Commission website, and people could go look at those. This issue of using data to make your case. In this case, the proposal was very data driven. There were, several of the questions were, quantify how many people you expect will, what the increase in walking or bicycling will be from this project. So, and you could get, some communities got pretty creative in doing that and probably lost a little bit of, lost some credibility, but others did a really methodical job of saying, okay, we know that, so many people are traveling on this route. We know that this facility will be within, this distance. Studies show that X% of people, will shift from driving to walking or bicycling. I mean, they really went through and did it methodically. And, again, sometimes you may need to go out and get data at the beginning of your proposal. So I'm just working with a proposal now where I suggested that they go out and do a survey of the school kids in this town, a small town in the Sierra, to see what the parents, it's a survey of the parents of the kids, to see if there's a perception of danger on this road. It's a rural area, and they didn't get funded last time. And Caltrans in the debrief told them, well, your data on crashes was not, you really stretched it too much. So, so I, since, and apparently there aren't any, nobody's been killed yet on this road. That's basically the bottom line. So, but it, but everybody sort of feels that it's not a safe road to walk along or to cross the street. Well, go out and do a survey. If the perception is that it's unsafe, that's really good to know. So that's a place where, you may not have, hard data that shows there's a problem here, but you can do something, a surrogate of that, like a survey that will help. In the case of these proposals, they asked for maps. They asked for, show your project area clearly. And this is an example, I think, of one that really clearly lays out, what their proposal is. I think it's an overpass over a highway. So they're showing, bike lanes. They're showing, pedestrian overcrossing, pedestrian bicycle overcrossing, where it connects to the rest of the bicycle network. I mean, they did a really good job in this one little graphic so that the reader can quickly, sort of pick it up. There are some, and I just went through, I don't know, how many did Josh and I look at? About 50 or 60, yeah, each of us. We were just looking at one piece of these proposals, but I was trying to find maps. They were all supposed to include maps showing that they've met, the disadvantaged community requirement. And, I'd say half had these awful, really hard to read maps in there, which, if you make it hard for your reviewer, it's not a good thing. So again, a good picture is worth 1,000 words. Oh, and by the way, they also required in these, and I think it's really good to send pictures showing the area that you're focused on. If it's a physical project, do the math. And this really is about being strategic and maximizing your points. So on the right, we see that for this particular application, question 1 and 2 get a lot of the points come from that. I think there were 5 or there's 6 questions, so 6 questions total, and some of them only get 10 or 15. So you really want to make sure that you do a good job with those other ones, but you also don't want to punt on the other, the smaller ones, because that can often be the difference, especially if there's hundreds of applicants. The dividing line is going to be very narrow. So if you can even eke out, and I saw some that we were reviewing whether they met disadvantaged community requirements, and some really did a good job. I mean, they may have been a pretty wealthy community, but they showed that this project was in a neighborhood. Maybe if you looked at the census tract, it didn't look like a disadvantaged community, but they went out and got data on, well, they could look at free and reduced price meals at schools, and they looked at the sub area within the census tract, and maybe they got 1 or 2 points out of 5, but that it was probably worth their time, because that could have been the difference on whether they got funded or not. And this one, I think, and we skipped over some that were just too specific to this project. I think this obviously is one that you don't want to do, particularly for these types of grants. Don't annoy your reviewer. And again, going through these, this was something that I think Caltrans did a better job in setting up the application, so it would be a little easier, for people to fill out, and also for reviewers to go through. But some of the pet peeves, having to hunt through to find information. And actually, I fault Caltrans on this proposal, because they really, at the beginning of the proposal, should require a description and a map. Because often that was like somewhere in the appendices in the back, and it was not easy to find. The photos, the graphics, grainy, confusing, etc. Putting see previous answer is one of the biggest mistakes, because the reviewers are told that you can only that you have to give points based on what's in that response. So you basically have to give a 0 if somebody says see previous answer. It's just not going to fly. And one of the reasons that we were contracted by Caltrans to do these workshops and trainings was that in this first cycle of grants, they said they saw a lot of good projects, but bad applications. So I think that's part of what they were trying to do, is say, okay, what can we do to help communities do better applications? And we're hoping that in the cycle 2, even though we didn't get in there early enough, I think, to really do some help, they got better applications.
And I can't also reiterate the importance of just really concisely and clearly answering the question and answering the question.
Yeah.
In some of my past experiences reviewing proposals at the EPA, it's stunning how many people don't answer the question. Mm-hmm. And it's really frustrating for the reviewer.
Yeah. In some regards, I think government grants are a little simpler and more straightforward than foundation grants. Because foundation grants, you sort of feel like you do have to be more creative. There often aren't, clear. You often don't get respond to these questions. I mean, sometimes you will, but sometimes it's just like, send us a narrative description and a project. What's the project here's a summary of what might go into a proposal. And it's a little bit more free form with foundations, whereas with government, usually it's very clear. They give you, answer this, 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 and this. So as Jenny was saying, you've got to make sure you answer the questions. And to me, that really should be easier to do than having to, really try to make, with a foundation, you may really have to try to communicate how exciting your project is, and that's not often easy to do. Just generally, some final comments. Start early, and I think, Jenny, you have a handout you were going to send everybody that has some of this. Start early. Start writing, sections if you need to. Just start set up put together an outline. Often your outline can be based on if there's clear sections that they're asking for, set that outline up, start fleshing it out. Waiting till the last week is often sort of a disaster, recipe for disaster, because and I've been through many of those. Often it happens because there's other things you're working on. But we had one proposal, actually it got funded, that we were working with an organization in LA, and it was due at 5 p.m. I think at the Caltrans district office, and they were going up the elevator at like 2 minutes to 5, signing papers in the elevator to get it in on time. And actually, it got funded, which sort of blew my mind. But it was just one of those things where it was like last minute stuff. The budget thing, we haven't talked much about budget, but I think it is. I often like to start sort of doodling around with a budget early in the proposal, just to because often, if you need to figure out sort of how much can you do with this project. And if you start writing a whole bunch and start saying we're going to do all this big stuff, and you haven't done a budget to sort of basically ground truth it a bit, then you find that oops, that's not going to work. So I think it's helpful as you're starting to write your narrative to say, okay, we're saying we're going to do 10 workshops. Let me just check and see how much that's going to cost. And if this grant is only for up to 100,000. We already have some experience here doing this kind of stuff, so we know more or less what we can do. But sometimes, you want to make sure you do the budget, figure out, okay, what's this going to cost, and double check those, because sometimes if you go too far, you sometimes it's too late. Yeah, feedback. Oh, question from Drew about what kind of feedback do we get from program officers. I'm trying to remember, I guess I haven't been doing as many foundation proposals in the last few years. I'm trying to remember how much feedback we've really gotten.
I think it's usually it starts off with you maybe would have a conversation and get a little feedback on the main idea, but you probably wouldn't get feedback on the proposal itself. But I know what we do in LGC is we'll share it with each other to whoever's working on the proposal, share back and forth and get edits. But then at the very end, we also like to share it with someone that hasn't been working on it, because sometimes you think what you're saying makes sense because it's all in your head, but it doesn't, or you miss small grammatical errors. So those are kinds of things that we do.
The one thing I'll say about, now I guess, so I wasn't clear, I guess Drew was asking about feedback in the process of writing the proposal. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's unlike. Well, one thing to know is that with government grants, once the RFP has gone out, they will not talk to you. They will only respond. So there is often an opportunity to ask questions. They get posted. Basically they'll say, send us your questions. They'll get. We'll put out the response. A few weeks before they're due, and different people will send in questions, and they'll post all their responses. But you will not be able to talk to anybody who's direct, in any way related to the project. So if you know that a grant's going to be coming out from an agency, it's really good to get in there and talk to them before it gets, issued. Because once it's on the, sort of on the street, they will not talk to you because of, potential conflicts of interest, etc. Foundations probably may not be quite as strict about that. And some foundations actually will work with you on your proposal. It depends on the foundation. If they've asked you to do something, we've had a number of foundations that, sort of say, well, here's what we'd like. We send them a draft. They say, no, that really is, you're missing this or that. Give us, we're more focused on this, or your budget seems too high, some way you can cut it. So foundations, especially if they know you and you're working with collaboratively, there's a lot more communication. But if it's sort of, just a call for proposals, usually they're pretty strict about not communicating, not talking to you much at that point. Qualification, so some of the things that often, you'll have to prepare in a proposal is, an executive summary, which often is best to do at the end. Just sort of once you've written everything else, you put that together. There's often some sort of statement of need, or what's the problem you're trying to address right up front. And like in this projects with a proposal for Caltrans that did get funded last year, they were sort of saying, well, you know, your statement of need really wasn't very strong. We didn't really feel that this community, you know, that it didn't seem strong enough to us to fund it. And then there's often, you know, you're describing what your project is going to do, what, you know, be clear about what the objectives are, time frame, you know, and then there'll often also be a scope of work, which is not listed there, where you actually break out, you know, task by task. You know, here's how we'll do it. And often I find it really is helpful when you're doing that to really be doing the budget sort of next to it, or almost, you know, start with a budget and then next to it I have the task, and that sort of reminds me of all the steps that need to happen. I mean, just me, but I find that doing a scope of work, the budget really goes next to it really nicely. And then often there is a section on, you know, sort of your qualifications, your organization information that sometimes is up front, sometimes it's the tail end. Some proposals will ask for resumes or CV curriculum vitae for all the staff working on it. Sometimes they'll just ask for senior staff. I mean, there's all kinds of, you know, variations. We just had this one that Jenny and I worked on, where they wanted curriculum vitae for pretty much all the staff. I mean, like everybody was going to work on it. So even junior staff, we had to get CVs included in there. I think anything else on that?
No, I'll just reiterate that we did put together a resource document that goes along with this, and we'll send it out right after this training. And it goes in a little bit more depth on some of these segments. And there are some of the resources at the bottom. There's links to websites where they go into even further depth about some of these sections.
Is there another slide, or was this the last one? Oh, you had some. Yeah.
Yeah, so once you get your grant, it's on to managing your grant. And really, it just gets back to project management. So the initial training from orientation that you guys had, and then the training by Dexter, you know, think back on that and everything you learned about those best practices about managing your grant. But specifically for funding that you receive, there's some specific things to keep in mind. So really making sure your financial house is in order, that as he pointed out in some of the proposal, it will say what you need to have in terms of for your accounting staff, what kind of audits you will have needed to have, or types of insurance that you need to have in order to do it. So making sure you have the right accounting. Some will be very strict about you need accounting procedures set up in a certain way, and specific things like with the Civic Spark grant, we had to have a really clear procedures set up in order to get the money. We needed to prove we had that. Also reviewing and understanding the key documents. It may be 6 months, a year before, since you applied until you get the funding. So re-reviewing the proposal that you submitted, the original instructions for what you were filling out, and then usually maybe they'll send another document afterwards. Really becoming familiar with those and familiarizing yourself with the budget again for all the tasks and deliverables that you need to provide. Really critical that your project manager is really comfortable and can remember all those things. Keeping up on reporting and budgeting, so making sure that you're not overspending, you're not underspending. In a lot of cases, if you underspend, you're not going to get that money. So you need to make sure that you're kind of on track and you know, keeping track of all that. And then reporting, a lot of places will have reporting requirements. Again, it's really dependent on what type of funding it is. Sometimes it could be a monthly report, quarterly report, annual report. Sometimes it may just be the final report that you're required to do, and sometimes they'll have specific outlines that you need to fill in. Other times it's a little bit more open-ended, so making sure you have a good understanding of that and what's required. And not only is it helpful for them, but it also can be really helpful for you to be able to look back and show what you've accomplished that you could then use in future proposals or in future efforts. So It may seem annoying in the moment to have to report on it, but it's really good to have that history to look at. And then identifying how to work with your partners and what is the working relationship going to look like? What's the working relationship you're going to have with your funder? What's the working relationship with your other partners? Are you going to set up monthly calls? Are they going to be calls? Are they going to be in person? Figuring out all those logistical things to begin with, so you're not 3 months in realizing you're supposed to have monthly project management calls from the beginning. So those are kind of the main things to keep in mind. I don't know, Paul, if there's anything else that comes up.
Yeah, no, I think that's all of this is really important, because what often happens is, you put a lot of effort into writing a proposal, and then if it gets fine, it's like, oh, great. And then sometimes the project sits for a few months before you get rolling, and then you realize, oops, we're behind on some of the deliverables. Or often what happens at the end of a grant is that you realize, oops, we haven't gotten everything done. So having good project management throughout is really key. I mean, I've got one project right now where we're sort of scrambling to finish a number of deliverables that probably should have gotten done 6 months ago, but because there were some challenges at that point, we didn't work on them, and now we're really up against, you're up against the clock. You've got 4 or 5 months left, and you've got to scramble to get everything done, and you want to make sure, as Jenny said, that your budget is sort of in line with what you anticipated spending. We've had some grants where at the end, you give back money because you didn't spend it all. Other projects where we underestimated the budget and now we're going over, but you want to do a good job with the project at the end, so that you have that good track record that's going to set you up for other grants in the future. And I think that's one thing LDC has been generally very successful with over the decades, really, because we see that there are some funders that we used to have that we no longer have, but often it's because they changed focus, not because we did something that alienated them. Often we do have funders that and the thing to keep in mind, especially with foundations, is that often they'll fund you at the start of a project or a new program area, but they also want you to show that you can basically go off on your own, don't need them throughout. So that is also something that happens a lot with foundations. But if you don't do a good job with those those initial grants, you're not going to see grants in the future.
Any questions? You can type them in now, or we can unmute you. Let's just give a minute or so. Any questions in the room?
How long does it typically take to get these grants produced? Is it really just depending on what they ask, or?
Yeah, it really depends on the complexity but most proposals, I'd say you've got to give yourself like 2 months to work on. And you'll see most RFPs that come out typically will be for like a 3-month period, unless it's if it's an RFP that's coming out from a city for a project that's sort of more of a consultant project, they may be like a month. That might be pretty short. But one thing we haven't talked about is also the interview process, because sometimes with government grants, they'll often do, they may get 12, 13 proposals, and they'll pick three teams to interview. And we now team with private consultants on projects, so we, every few months we're on teams where we go in as part of an interview team, basically, to see how we, and then they'll pick the team they like after that. So having a few months is, I think, you want to at least, I would say, if you can have 2 to 3 months, that's probably the ideal. And for really big, complex ones, there was just one out recently from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that was just this enormous thing that we didn't, we wouldn't have qualified. Even other organizations bigger than us said they didn't qualify. They were asking for like a preliminary response, and then they'll select the organization to submit the full proposal. So, and that's, I think, the group that I know, one of the groups that went after it is one of these really big nonprofits that works nationally and is all over the place. So, but most are not that complicated. Most are a little bit more condensed. But yeah, the one thing that is always challenging is when the deadlines for these proposals are, I had one that was like the week after Thanksgiving or the week after Christmas, and that they do that, and I'm ready to kill these grant makers. There's actually, I should find this art. There's an article that a friend of mine wrote, a colleague that I know wrote in Planning Magazine, that was sort of a letter to funders with some tips on, how to, and it had things like that. Don't have a deadline. Because what ends up happening is, I remember one Thanksgiving, I worked the whole weekend on this big HUD. It was a HUD proposal, which we didn't get. That was very annoying. But
It's nice for them.
yeah, well, it might be nice for them, but yeah, that's being, and then the kinds of, again, it had tips on things that, let me see if I can dig that up.
Okay.
Remind me, it's Tim Baldwin who worked for, it was mostly from the consultant's standpoint, it wasn't from the nonprofit. But as a consultant, he just wrote this one-page article, or two-page article in Planning Magazine just saying, here's some tips on how to do a better job. Some of which, for example, with some of these cap and trade, somebody asked about cap and trade, or the Caltrans active transportation program, they're all paper. They're still requiring people to send in, volumes, tons of paper applications in an era when, it should be possible to do all of this online.
Or we had a fax in questions.
Oh, that.
For one proposal.
Oh, that, yes.
They wouldn't accept them via email. You had to fax.
Yes. Yes, fax or mail.
Or mail.
Or post, yeah. And it's like, this was from Caltrans. This was just a few months ago. I mean, what century are we in? Yeah.
So another question is, if we're interested in learning how to write grants, what avenues do you know that are available to us?
Well, I think the Nonprofit Center that I listed towards the beginning is a really good resource to check on. I know they do classes and trainings, and I have to confess I've never been to one, but I have heard they're good.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of links that Paul provided in this presentation. There's links also in the resource document that I'll send out. There's tons of classes that are out there if you search for grant writing classes, but I would say really learning how to write grants just comes from practice and getting opportunities to start doing it. And really, it's not rocket science.
Right.
It's following instructions, having some ideas, and going from there. And it's just getting, whatever organization you work with, asking to be involved, maybe just in one or two here or there, and maybe starting in small ways, helping out with the organizational section where it's just gathering resumes and talking about your organization and doing those simple things first, and then getting a little bit more experience.
I think one thing that has changed in a big way in proposals, it used to be that you'd have like a development director, somebody who would look for funding. I think more and more nonprofits now, different people do proposals. Yeah.
Well, one of my questions was, I'm assuming in most of these cases you already have the project all planned out, and once you get to that stage, you guys then begin looking for grants that fit that, or do you ever find that you change the project to fit the grant, and is that an okay thing to do? Or?
Yeah, no, I think it's both. Sometimes you'll see an RFP or call for proposal, and you'll say, that's something we're really well suited to do. Actually, that one that Jenny and I worked on was one that Caltrans put out, and we looked at it and we thought, wow, this looks like a perfect fit for us. It wasn't an existing project, it would have been a new project. So there's quite a few times when you'll see, a call for proposals where you say this is something we have the capacity, we have the track record, experience, et cetera, to go after. The ones that are tricky is where you sort of feel maybe you've got part of it, but you don't have all of it. And that's where the partnering comes in, You'll say, we can't do this all on our own, but if we team up with, these other three organizations, then we can do it. And then it's a question of seeing if they're willing to partner, and then who's going to be the lead. Because whoever's the lead is going to be the one who's working, does most of the work on the proposal, but also will receive more of the funding because you'll be managing the project. So there is a trade-off. So Project for Public Spaces, for example, on that EPA, they originally asked us if we would be the lead, and I said, no, I didn't think so. I think it's better if somebody on the East Coast does it. So they took it on, and they now manage it. They get additional funding for that. So it can be either way. The other option is you have a really good idea, and you're thinking about what you can do, and then you just start looking for who might fund something like that.
Along the same lines, when you're trying to figure out what grants to go after, do you tend to like almost try and submit as many as possible and find those opportunities to work them in, or is it more like find the big ones, the big opportunities, spend a lot of time?
What's your answer on that?
For LGC, we've created criteria for our organization because there are so many grant opportunities, and you could spend, every day writing a grant. So we've tried to follow these criteria. We try of, and it could be different things, like it's a new project area that we really want to get into. It fits within our current strategic goals. So you could have different criteria. It's also like, is the effort worth it? If for maybe an organization like LGC now, going after $20,000 may not be worth it, when we could go after, put in almost the same amount of effort for $100,000, $150,000. So I think it's really dependent on the organization and what you need.
Yeah.
And where you're at financially in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there have been periods when we've gone after a lot of things because we're always worried, because there's always concern with nonprofits that you're not going to have enough funding to manage. I think we've gotten a little bit more deliberate in the last few years where we're like, okay, let's really look at this carefully and see, because I've worked on some proposals where I sort of knew we didn't have much of a chance. It's like, why are we putting all this, because it takes a lot of time and effort. I mean, you could spend easily 80 hours, 120 hours, if you start, I mean, you and I probably spent 120 hours each on that CalTrans proposal, because it was part of it was so badly prepared. I mean, frankly, it was really what they were asking for, the way they asked it. There was so much duplication, et cetera. But anyways, that's the reality. You just have to respond to what they ask. And that one was one that we've really had a good shot at. We didn't get it, but we thought we really had a good shot, and it made sense to put that much effort into it. But there are others where you look at them and you say, this really is not us, and that's where the criteria, I think, really help.
So how many people normally work on a grant? Is it usually 2 to 3 people, or does it just depend on the grant?
Depends on the grant, but mostly 2 to 3. I mean, we have a managing director that does a lot of our budgeting and works with accounting. So often she'll get involved on the budget and help out with that. I've actually worked on enough proposals now that I often do the budget for the proposals I'm working on, or at least pieces, and then I'll have her, maybe I'll ask her to review it. And often it'll be typically at least 2, I'd say, and sometimes 3 or 4, some bigger ones, more people.
Any final questions? I know it's a little after 12:30, so I want to respect our time. So if you do have other questions, you can email me, and Paul and I can answer the question and get back to you. And we'll share all the resources that we talked about during the training today with you right afterwards. And wanted to give a big thank you to Paul for doing this. We really appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for participating. Have a good day.
Have a good weekend. It's Friday.